And welcome to My Community, your weekly program that allows Barbadians to share and indulge in the rich history and traditions of their communities, which serve to enrich the lives of our people. I am Miles Eversley. Very warm welcome to our viewers around the world, those of you who continue to follow us weekly via the World Wide Web. In our last program, Ona Harewood reminded us that it takes a village to raise a child. Here she is again. She begins by speaking about entertainment.
The dance halls, or the dance houses. No, I would not have been able to go to any dances, right? Because I was too young. But I know that Harewood was a place where dances were held. My mother would have gone to some there. And King George V as well was a popular dance spot. Later on, there was some place called the Rat Trap, but that was not in our side of St. Philip. That was closer to racist side of things, and that was more of a nightclub. But for sure, St. Catherine's Club was one, but that was again a little further up from where we were. So those are the places that I grew up hearing people went to dances. The Well House Pirates were a big name back then too. This was a volleyball group, and they became more like a cultural and social group. They held a lot of events. And I think they had a Valentine's dance that was fairly popular, Valentine's fair / dance. So I got to go because I was going to the fair, but I stayed back for the dance, right? Of course, by then you had a curfew and had to be home by a certain time. But by then we were like 15, 16, so it wasn't really a big issue. But yes, the Pirates, I remember the Well House Pirates. And the Well House Pirates was a big volleyball group. They played competitively, and they were based. The home base was somewhere between Well House and Riverland. And I remember they had branding and everything. That's how big they were. And they did a lot of community things. And yes, they held an annual, I think it was a Valentine's Day, sometime around that time. And we all prepared for it as young people because that was the place to be. Let's talk about some of the experiences that me and some of my parents would have had in the village. Because, like I said, the culture of the neighborhood was also a big part of helping us to shape us and make us who we were. We talk about the Bajan way of doing things and of the sharing and caring. No, I lived that in the neighborhood. So my grandmother had a garden at home, and she grew lots of things, carrots, she had spinach, she had a kitchen garden, all the herbs, and then she had some fruit trees and so on. She planted sweet potatoes and so on. Now, when it was time to reap those things, she would reap them, and she would pack the bag, and she would say to me, go to Miss Holligan and give her this. And I would make my way to Miss Holligan's house, and I would tell her that my grandmother sent these. And she would offload the bag, and I would think, okay, well, I'm going back home. No, she would then load the bag with what she had, and she would give it to me. So I made 2 trips with a heavy bag, right? Because my grandmother sent and somebody sent back. And that was the culture. Whatever you had, you gave somebody else, and somebody else gave you some, and so on. And that's how we grew up. Those are the things that we saw. So it wasn't unusual then for, you know, if my grandmother didn't have something, for somebody to say, oh, Miss Mason, come hold this, you know, and then she would in turn say, but do you have it? And you would give him. So you always had stuff being circulated around the neighborhood. Nobody was selfish. And you could leave your doors open. I sometimes have to remind my mother, no, that those days have gone, and she has to make sure that she lock and close the door. But back then, my grandmother would go and leave the door open. And if she had clothes outside and the rain came down, the neighbor would pick them up, and there was nobody thought anything strange about it. People looked out for each other. I'm not saying we don't look out for each other now, but I think people really looked out for each other back then in the community. And we knew one another. That's the other thing. Everybody knew everybody. So if you saw somebody that didn't fit, you knew immediately that that person was probably a visitor, maybe a stranger, but you definitely knew your neighbors. I knew everybody in my neighborhood. You know, even if I didn't know them by name, I knew who they were. But the community has expanded so much now. It's very different. But back then, we all knew one another. And I knew where everybody lived. You know, when I passed the house, I knew who lived there and so on, you know. So that was the kind of vibe that we had in the community. And then the food the things that we got to experience and we got to eat in the community was very different to today. I don't think my grandmother ever made macaroni pie. My grandmother died at 93 years old, and I don't think she ever made a macaroni pie. My mother is the one who introduced macaroni pie to the household, and I don't think it was a favorite for my grandmother either, but she never made anything like that. She stuck to her ground provisions and so on. So you had cuckoo with cornmeal, you have breadfruit cuckoo, you have green banana cuckoo. Whatever she could put her hands on that could make a thing, she made it. You got crushed yam and those kinds of things. But I never saw my grandmother for all of my life make any macaroni pie. I don't think she even knew how to make it. She cooked the old-fashioned way, but when you woke up and you smelled certain smells, you knew what was coming. So when it was time for cassava, because my grandmother grew her own cassava, so there was a process to go through. She would dig the cassava, and then, you know, you would grate it, and out of that you got the starch going one side, and then she would dry the cassava, and that cassava made bakes, it made dumplings and so on. And her cassava bakes were so good. You know, her cassava bakes were so good, and you got bakes on mornings for breakfast. She made all kinds. She made cornmeal bakes, she made regular flour bakes, she made cassava bakes, but whatever was in season, she would improvise. And that was no different to the other older folks in the neighborhood, you know, because we would move around the neighborhood, and people would give us things. I remember there was a lady that called Prob. We called her Prob, but her name was, I think her name was Cecilia Proverbs. So you understand Prob. And I spent a lot of time at her house because she had some grandchildren or great-grandchildren who were my contemporaries. So in the summer vacation, sometimes we would play Monopoly at her house. And that was another big thing. A whole set of us would gather in the living room and play Monopoly. And Prob always made sure that we had something to eat. No matter how many people were in the house, everybody got something to eat. And she would make these cassava hats, these old hats. And those things tasted so good, you know. And she would make maubee, not from syrup. She made maubee from the bark. And she would make a large container of maubee, and everybody in the house would get some. Or when she made lemonade, everybody would get some. And to me, they had a way of doing things that it just tasted so good. So the foods, even the foods that we ate back then, would have influenced, you know, us and how we reacted and perceived certain things, because it wasn't modern food. It was the old stuff that we got as children. My grandmother made cherry jam. So we had a cherry tree. We lost it in Elsa, and it was really, really sad, because that was the last thing standing that my grandmother had planted. And she planted that cherry tree. And it was probably over 10 feet tall. It was a huge tree. It was uprooted in the hurricane. So, you know, that I felt a little emotional when I saw it, because that was all that was left. But she planted that cherry tree, and when that cherry tree was in bloom, she made cherry jam. She boiled it from scratch, and she had all these bottles. You would come in, you knew when it was jam season. You would come in and you would see all these bottles lined off in the kitchen, and it was like, oh, she's making cherry jam. And as many bottles of jam that she would make, people got jam. She would send me to this person. Oh, carry a bottle of jam for this person. This person got a bottle of jam. We had a relative who had a young child, and she made sure that his bottle of jam went across to the house, you know. I don't know how to make cherry jam, no. And I say, you know, maybe I should have paid a little more attention when my grandmother was making this jam, so that now I would know how to do it. But she just, you know, you would see her in the kitchen stirring on this big pot, and I was just waiting for the jam to finish. I wasn't interested in how it was being made. But again, there was this self-sufficiency that they practiced. So when it was time to make jam, she made jam. If she could get enough gooseberries, she would make the gooseberry jam as well. So it was a home economics, not the home economics in school, but it was a system of economics that they practiced that was very, very interesting. So all your seasonings were grown at home, your carrots were grown at home, and my grandmother had a green thumb, so everything that she planted did very well. I remember she would dig nuts, and I didn't know you had to wait for the nuts to dry, so I would try to crack the nuts and realize the thing ain't opening, and I can't figure out what was happening. And she was like, no, you have to, and she would put them out in the sun to dry, and eventually then when they dry, you would break them out, and sometimes you would roast them in the oven and stuff. But we ate a lot of what we what we grew at home. The sweet potatoes, the same thing. The yams, the same thing. And the neighbor would give her breadfruit, and when the neighbor gave her breadfruit, then that was a meal, you know. I saw people like Prob and my grandmother and those people do give you a meal with very little. But by the time they were finished, everybody in the house, whoever was there and wanted some, was able to get some. And I really admire that. I really admire that. Now, one thing I did not admire was the process of washing my school shirts and my socks. They were white. And my grandmother insisted that they be washed a particular way. And that particular way took an entire weekend. I never understood why it had to take the whole weekend to wash these clothes. Her response was that I must not have any dingy clothes. I was like washing them. So you had to ball them, and then you had another process where you had to put them in blue soap, and you had to put them out in the sun, and you had to make sure that you sprinkle. And this was too much work. So one weekend I decided I am washing these clothes my way. So I got up and I got my soap powder. Of course, we talking about hand washing because there wasn't any machine washing then. At least we didn't have a machine, so I had to wash by hand. So I decided, well, I'm washing them my way. And I got up and I washed everything and I put them on the line. Guess what happened? My grandmother picked up every single thing off the line and made me start over. I did not have a choice. I had to wash them the way she wanted them washed. And my mother was not intervening to help me either, you know. That was, you know, because as far as she was concerned, I suppose that was the right way to do it. So I had to suffer and wash these whites every weekend. It was religiously, or every weekend you knew what was coming. But those whites stayed white. And I would wear them a whole school year and they never lost their color. So I guess she knew what she was talking about, right? But I guess as young people, we didn't really want to get through that hassle of having to do all of this that she thought was necessary to have them to stay awake. And another thing that I also found interesting was she made her own starch, and she would starch her clothes and iron them. And that was another process. Thankfully, I didn't have to starch my shirts, but she would starch her clothes. And when she's finished, she thinks it'll be stiff, because, you know, that was the natural starch that came from the cassava. And I remember as I grew up and then started to work, I bought spray starch. And my grandmother almost had a heart attack because she couldn't understand starch in a can. What do you mean starch in a can? You need to starch this thing the normal way. And no, that's going to take too long. I don't have time for that. I have to go to work. So I then started using spray starch. And I don't think she ever wrapped her head around that. She died and never understood how starch happened to be in a can when, as far as she knew it, it was something that came from the cassava, and you kept it and you used it to starch your clothes. I was grateful for the experience. There was another gentleman when I was a little girl in the neighborhood called Palu. His name was Louis, but everybody referred to him as Palu. And I remember him, I could still see him in my mind's eye to this day. He was a dark, tall gentleman with a big stomach, and he kept cows. And he also planted a lot of things around the neighborhood. And when it was time to butcher a cow, he would come around the neighborhood and he would engage the meat. And he would come to our house and my grandmother would say how much she wanted, and he would write down how much for her, how much for her. And then when the process was completed, he would deliver the meat to the house. And, you know, again, that was just another interesting experience that we had, because a lot of what we ate didn't necessarily come from the supermarket in the traditional way. So somebody would kill a pig, they would come and they would engage the pork. Cow, same thing. I don't really recall my grandmother keeping chickens. So I think we probably got our chickens from the supermarket. But the fish was another experience. Now, I understand that you would have fish vendors who would leave bare field, because, you know, you have skeets behind the fishing boats. And they would come and they would walk through the neighborhood and they would sell their fish. Now, I don't remember that specifically. That's what my grandmother and my mother would have told me. But my experience was the conch shell. From the time you heard the conch shell, you knew that fish was coming. And you would hear the conch shell blowing, and then you would see the van and you would hear people shouting, fish, fish, how much have $1, how much have $1? And the van would come through the neighborhood and people would come up with their pans, and we would buy fish from the guy selling fish in the can. So we didn't have to go to the market. The fish came to your door, and I think it was fresh fish because I don't know that there was a lot of icing at the time. So when they had a catch, they would try to get rid of it. So they would come through the neighborhood and they would blow the conch shell. And as a little girl, you know, you run out and you think this is so exciting and so interesting. And my grandmother would buy the fish and sometimes the flying fish, and they would scale and gut and bone the fish. Now, I was taught very early how to scale and gut. I never learned how to bone. So I never learned how to bone. So my job would be I would help with the scaling, and then when they trusted me to use the knife properly, I would gut the fish, but I never learned how to bone the fish. And again, I think that's something that my grandmother probably went to her grave thinking, I failed this child because I don't know how to bone fish. But that was again part of the process of living in the village. And again, as a little girl, we bought sometimes, if my grandmother didn't have the sweet potatoes and stuff, there was a guy who used to come around on a donkey cart, and he would sell potatoes and yams and whatever he had in the cart. Now, as a 5, maybe 6-year-old, I was fascinated with the animal. So when the donkey cart came, I would run out and I would go up to the donkey and stuff, and they would have to be telling me, don't get too close, don't get too close. But I was so fascinated with this animal, and I begged for a ride on the cart, and then I never got it. But I was so interested in this donkey cart business, you know, and he had the old-time scale, and he would hold it up, and he would put in the potatoes, and then he would put the weights, and they would work out, and here my grandmother would bargain, and she would say, well, it's a little short on this side, and how much money at the end? They would have that again was a whole affair, right? But I never paid a whole lot of attention to it because I was very interested in the animal, and I have not seen a donkey cart in the neighborhood for years. That was another experience that we had. And then there was a gentleman, I think he was from town. He was a tinsmith. And he would come to the neighborhood, and he would have all these pots and pans and different things hanging on from everywhere. And he would be shouting, stove barrels and baking pans, baking. I can hear it as clearly today in my mind. I can see him coming down the gap, and he would be shouting, stove barrels and baking pans, baking pans. And, you know, I didn't know what it was about at first, but eventually as I got older, they explained to me that he was a tinsmith, and he would be selling baking pans and stove barrels. I think it was for the kerosene stove and stuff like that. And you could buy them from him because he brought them to your house. I remember just the other day I was talking to my mother about it, and I was saying, but I wonder whatever became of that kind of business. I think he's probably passed on because he was a big man when I was a little girl. But that is an image that is burned sharply into my mind. I don't think I will ever forget it. I can still see this man coming down the neighborhood with all these pots and pans. And people bought stuff from him, you know, people bought baking pans and so on from him. And then the Avon lady was another feature of the neighborhood. Her name was Lorraine. Again, I will never forget her. I could see her in my mind very clearly in her dress, that 60s style dress, and she had her case on her head. And she came around, she sold Avon Cosmetics. And my mother would buy stuff from her. I remember the timeless products, the lotions and the sprays and the perfumes and stuff. All came from the Avon lady who brought them directly to the door. And she would come on Sunday in the evenings and she would shout, and my mother would go out and she would come and she would open the case, and she would come in, she'd be invited in. She would open the case and she would show you what she had, and mommy would say, well, I want this, that, and that. And she would, they would do their business, and that's how she bought her perfumery and those kinds of things, right? So the Avon lady was also a big feature of the neighborhood, and she herself was from St. Philip. I think she was from Blaze Hill, right? So she would come around to the neighboring communities and she would sell her products. I don't know what ever became of her, but I remember as a child for sure, this lady coming to the house with her Avon products. But you know, it is from the older folks that we got, the older folks at the time, that we got these glimpses into what Barbados was like as they were growing up before our time. And I always say the education that we got from them is an education you could not get anywhere else. The formal education system could never give you that kind of education. So when my grandmother say, all engaged pork don't sell, I understood what she meant, because you know that sometimes when the man came and engaged the pork, I would say I want 10 pounds, but by the time the pig killed and he come in with 10 pounds, you don't want 10 pounds anymore. You something has happened or you change your mind or something. So I understood the Barbadian saying that all engaged port don't sell, you know. And as young people, you know, in typical youthful exuberance, sometimes you want to do something in a hurry. And my grandmother would say, well, if greedy with hot, we're cool. And I was like, yes, I know what that meant because you lived it, right? You saw it played out before you. I remember one day she asked me for a halfpenny. And I was like, a what? What is a halfpenny? And I don't think I ever got an answer that day. But one day, I picked up a cent off the ground. And she said, oh, you have a halfpenny? And I was like, oh. And then I found out by asking that it was really, she was referring to a half penny. Because remember, she would have come up any time where they had pennies and shillings and that kind of currency. So when she said a halfpenny, I was like, oh, half. It was like a half penny, but they abbreviated it. So it became like a half penny and then a halfpenny. So I was like, oh. And then, of course, you know about the BBD and those kinds of things. We live that, you know. So when I see sometimes, like around Independence and I'm hearing all these Barbadian things, sometimes I chuckle because I remember growing up as a child and hearing these phrases being used to refer to some particular situation and knowing that being able to relate what I'm hearing now to the actual circumstance that would have produced that kind of response. So if you saw somebody coming down the neighborhood who the older people felt dressed a little too young for their age, it was not uncharacteristic to hear them say, oh, mutton posing as lamb. And when you think about it, I said, yes, it makes a whole lot of sense. Mutton posing as lamb, because this is somebody who they felt, obviously, should not be dressed in the way that they were dressed because they were dressed a little too young for their age. And it was very colorful, the language and the idiomatic expressions and the metaphors and stuff, the things that they use. Of course, they're not using fancy terms like that, but we now know it was very colorful. You could actually, if you thought about it enough, you could actually see it happening. And we saw it happening in the village. You know, that was all part of village life. And it didn't matter which older person he was talking to, they all spoke in color. And I like the color because it helped me to understand their point of view, their reference point. It helped me to understand my history and to appreciate the times that they would have lived in. And sometimes why they found it hard to relate to some of the things that we were doing, you know. But again, it was part of village life and part of the culture and part of the rich tradition and tapestry that we weave as we go along, you know. So I was very glad for some of those experiences that I had. There is one interesting experience I had just the other day, and it just made me realize that we ought not to have that divide between the past and the present. And as much as sometimes we've moved forward and we've become modern and stuff, for me at least, the history and the old time way is always lingering in the background. One of our relatives came to the house to collect something that my mother had for her. And my mother handed it over to her and said to her, if crab don't leave it whole, he won't get fat. No, I had never heard that expression at all. So I was like, Mommy, well, this is a new one. But she said, yeah, oh, you never heard that? Yeah. And I was like, you see, you always something to learn in the neighborhood, no matter how old you are, always something to learn. And that is an expression that I didn't know. But I appreciated the experience. So, you know, the tradition continues. And I think that we have a responsibility now to make sure that we pass on that tradition. Remember, we're using the analogy of the village to refer to all of these communities in St. Philip. Now, I got my childhood education in the community, and this is Bailey's Primary School. Now, I must say up front, I get a little peeved when I hear people saying Bailey's is 20-something years old. My grandmother attended Bailey's Primary School in the 1920s. So Bailey's Primary, as an institution of learning in St. Philip, has to be over 100 years old. I don't know how old it is for sure, but if my grandmother attended Bailey's in the 1920s, we're in the 2020s, so Bailey's has to have been at least 100 years old. So it's not 20 years old, it's not 25 years old, it's not 26 years old. Bailey's Primary School has had a long long tradition of educating girls first and then children in general in St. Philip. It's located in Merrick's in St. Philip. And um, back then, when my grandmother would have gone to Bailey's was a girls' school. Boys went to Shrewsbury, which was in Valhouse, just down the road. And that was a boys' only school. So girls went to Bailey's, boys went to Shrewsbury. But when I went to Bailey's had started accepting boys. So I actually went to a co-ed school. And again, Bailey's primary was an excellent experience. Not just about reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it was an interesting experience. Now, Bailey's primary was not the fancy building that it is today. Bailey's primary was a simple, one-story, unassuming, pink building. Kind of like what schools looked like back then. And there was a building behind the school that was the head teacher's residence. I think when I went to Bailey's, the head teacher was Miss Armstrong. And I think she lived in the residence at the time. Eventually, though, that residence became classrooms. And the head teacher lived at their own place, their own homes. But Bailey's was as simple as you can get. We had no frills, we had nothing. It was just a simple school. The school had two basic rooms, a big hall and a smaller section. The smaller section was occupied by the infants, infants A and infants B. I think the reception was somewhere else. I don't even remember if they had reception back then, but I know for sure there was an infants A and there was an infants B. And then the junior school was housed in the bigger hall. The head teacher had no office. The head teacher sat on the platform at a desk. And there was no staff room. The teachers had a desk at the front of the class, and that was their personal space. We had no kitchen or food and nutrition room. I don't know what you call it, but we didn't have that. There was a section that the school meal servers used. And you could sit at your desk and look over and see the school meal servers. And when the lunch came, you knew, because from the time they opened something, the smell, right, will pervade the entire building, and you will know, well, lunch is here. Eventually, though, I think maybe by the time I got to class 1, they put up a partition. So you could still smell, but you couldn't see. They kind of made a little divider, but you could still hear. We could hear the plates being washed. We could hear the clang, clang, the bang, bang. But somehow, in spite of all that, we did what we had to do as students, and learning went on. You know, I remember when the education officer came to the school and they would come into the door and everybody had to stand up and say, "Good morning, sir." And the person would go and sit next to the head teacher at the head teacher's desk. And it was right there, we could see it. You know, it wasn't anything fancy, and I don't think that it hindered learning. And now that I look back at it, I think that was just amazing, because it was just what we knew. It was our situation, and you would see them there talking, and you said good morning, you went back to doing what you were doing. And we could hear each class. So there was no classroom for class 1 and class. We didn't have any of that. It was just one big room, and the blackboard and the easel would separate the classes, and you would know, well, this is class 4 over here, and this is class 1, and this is class 2. That was also the time when teachers ate with the students, and you had to know if the meal was a meal that required a knife and fork. You couldn't eat with the fork and leave the knife. The teachers oversaw lunchtime, and not only did you have to use the knife and fork, but you had to get it right. And they would show you which hand was for the knife and which hand was for the fork, and you had to use the right hand and the right thing. And if you didn't do it, they would get up and they would come and they would switch it around and they would make you eat with your knife and fork. And I thought that, you know, I mean, back then it was just a pain in the butt. But as you got older, you really appreciated that experience, because if you had to do something later in life that required you to go somewhere formal, at least you knew how to eat with a knife and fork, right? And because you had to do it every day, once there was a meal that required it, you got into the habit of using your knife and fork. And I really appreciated and thank my teachers for that. I know that it wasn't something that they had to do, but back in the village, and our teachers were from the community, because my teachers lived down the road or up the road or across the road, right? My class 4 teacher was my cousin. So they took an interest in these students that went beyond just making sure that the students learn the formal things. And I really appreciated it. I really appreciated it.
An appreciative Ona Harewood on how the community school Bailey shaped her life. And that's exactly why these programs are produced, just for you. It underscores the importance of recording, sharing and preserving our local history. Thank you, Ona. My colleague Sherwood will be back next week. Take good care of yourself and look out for the interest of your neighbours. I am Miles Eversley. Thanks for your time. Goodbye.